Today, I will be presenting or introducing the second panel titled Seeking Relief from Fires and Ice, Emergency Response and Long-Term Recovery for Entrepreneurs in Crisis. This panel brings together the research from 5 diversity entrepreneurship fellows who have documented how California's Latinx business owners are navigating compounding crises such as wildfires, immigration enforcement, and systemic barriers to recovery resources. Today's presenters reveal critical gaps in our emergency response systems, from flea market vendors in Northern California losing customers due to ICE raids, to self-employed Latina housekeepers in Southern California working in toxic post-fire environments without protective equipment, to fashion district entrepreneurs watching 5 years of pandemic recovery unravel under rising rents and continued economic instability. All of these stories illuminate how vulnerable California's informal economy remains when disaster strikes. Our fellows will share not only what they learned from entrepreneurs on the ground, but also concrete policy recommendations for a more equitable disaster response. These are not abstract policy questions. They determine whether California's Latinx entrepreneurs can survive the next crisis. And the first presenter we have today is Yecenia Perez, who will be presenting on her talk, 5 years after COVID-19, how policy failures and rising rents continue to threaten Latino businesses in LA's fashion district. Yecenia is a first-generation student at the University of California, Berkeley, and a recent graduate who majored in legal studies and minored in public policy. Over the summer, Yecenia interned with California State Assembly member Celeste Rodriguez. Yecenia, raised in a low-income family of 6 in Los Angeles, California, is inspired by her lived experiences that have fueled her passion for social justice and dismantling inequalities in education and economic opportunity. Through the Cal and Sacramento Fellowship, Yecenia aims to expand her advocacy work and gain hands-on experience in public service while exploring how law and government intersects to advance justice and create equitable opportunities for communities of color. She aspires to pursue a career dedicated to dismantling oppressive systems and supporting underserved communities. So with that, please welcome Yecenia Perez.
Okay, I will go ahead and share my screen. Can you just let me know if you're able to see it?
We see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Rona.
You're welcome.
Okay, so the title of my presentation today is 5 years after COVID-19, how policy failures and rising rents continue to threaten Latino businesses in the Los Angeles fashion district. So before I get started, I just want to provide a brief description of the fashion district for those of you who aren't familiar, who haven't been there before. So before the pandemic, this was a vibrant hub. Think of it as like kind of a cultural marketplace of over 2,000 small, many Latino and minority-owned shops. And I have a picture here of before the pandemic so you can get an image of what it looked like. And essentially, there were a bunch of businesses packed in line, hundreds of businesses within dozens of blocks of the LA downtown area. And if you've ever been there, then you know that you can find almost anything there for a very affordable price, from phone accessories to electronics to clothing, food. And what's really interesting about the fashion district is that a lot of these shops are cash only, meaning that communities who maybe aren't as tech savvy, are older or low income, who don't have access to bank accounts, credit or debit cards, or things like that, are able to make purchases and buy different things that they need in very close proximity to different shops. And what's even more interesting is that unlike larger retail stores like Target and Walmart, you're actually able to engage in bargaining practices here. So it's very common that if you were able to make a purchase here, you'd actually be able to negotiate the price with the business owner and maybe even knock down a few couple dollars from whatever you're purchasing. And so why these businesses matter so much is because they're not only vital to LA's economy, but also to its cultural identity. And they provide financial flexibility for a lot of low-income people in Los Angeles. And if you grew up in Los Angeles like myself, it's very likely that you spent some weekends here with your family, listening to music, talking to people, strolling through different stores and eating food. And so I actually had the privilege of going there a little over 2 months ago to see how these businesses are doing and to talk to business owners. And I took this picture in the bottom, and I wanted to place it next to the first picture to really show the stark contrast and difference in the amount of people that are populating this area now. Whereas it used to be so difficult to even walk by other people at a normal speed because of how packed it was, there's no longer as much foot traffic there since the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's why I really wanted to center my research project on this area, because it's been suffering a lot since the COVID-19 pandemic. And so my research question was, how did PPP loans and other relief programs shape the survival and recovery of Latino-owned businesses in Los Angeles Fashion District 5 years after the pandemic? And I do talk about PPP loans, so I just wanted to explain PPP loans very briefly. They were established under the CARES Act to support small businesses during COVID-19, especially those that were experiencing a lot of losses due to the pandemic. These loan funds could be used to pay payroll, rent, mortgage interest, and utilities, and they were available to small businesses, nonprofits, veteran organizations, self-employed individuals, and even independent contractors. And so moving on to my data and methods, I really wanted to center on the voices of Latino entrepreneurs. And so I decided to conduct qualitative interviews with business owners like Adriana, who owns a small clothing shop, and she's actually the one that's depicted on the slide. Jose, who owns a herbal beauty shop, Jesus, who owns a blanket business, and a family-owned undergarment shop. I also reviewed reports from UCLA, Stand for Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative, and so much more. And I analyzed PPP funds and their impact on the survival of Latino-owned businesses. And so one of my initial findings was that relief programs actually missed the mark. Only 3% of Latino-owned businesses received the full amount they applied for, compared to 7% of white-owned businesses. And these are only the businesses that actually applied. Nearly 50% of Latino owners lacked adequate guidance or the application materials they needed to apply. The pandemic also added between $992 million to $2.3 billion in unpaid commercial rent across Los Angeles, hitting minority-owned businesses the hardest. Clothing and retail stores in the fashion district also saw a 24.6% decline in taxable sales during the pandemic, and by early 2024, the fashion district's vacancy rate hit 13.2%, the highest in over a decade. So as you can see, not only was there PPP funding gaps, but there was also barriers to access. People weren't able to pay their rents for the commercial spaces that they operate in, and they were making less sales. And because of that, a lot of businesses were actually closing down because it was no longer profitable to stay open. And so one of the most alarming findings for me after talking to people that I interviewed was that they were not only dealing with the pandemic over the past 5 years and the aftermath of it, but also with a compounding set of crises. And I included a brief timeline here, but I want to break down each event for you guys. So first of all, there's rising rents and shrinking profits, and I want to focus on the experience of Obed, who owns an undergarment shop. He shared with me that when he started his business in 2019, he paid $2,800 a month for his commercial space, and now he's paying $4,000. And I want to emphasize that this doesn't even include the amount of rent that he pays back at home where he lives with his family. He also had to sign 3-year contracts to renew his lease, and in them it's written how much rent will go up each year. So clearly, the rents are skyrocketing, and a lot of business owners feel forced to sign these leases, even if they're multi-year leases, and they highlight that the rent will increase each year because they don't want to lose on the investments and the time and effort that they have invested into these shops. For a lot of them, these are shops that they want to pass down to their children. And so a lot of them feel forced to stay open, even if they're getting into a lot of debt and are not making as much profit as they used to before. And to make matters worse, in February of 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually spiked gas prices. And as Jesus shared with me, a lot of these stores actually rely on wholesale buyers. As I previously mentioned, a lot of the purchases are very cheap. People like coming to the fashion district because they're able to make cheap purchases. But this means that these business owners really rely on wholesale buyers who buy many items at once to really make a profit. So as Jesus shared, there was often wholesale buyers coming from Bakersfield, Sacramento, San Francisco, and sometimes even out of state to buy wholesale for cheap and be able to take that product back at home and sell it for a higher price. But because the gas prices were increasing, it was no longer profitable for them, meaning that they were no longer coming as often. And so there was a decreased number of shoppers and decreased number of wholesale sales. In addition to that, as most of you know, the Los Angeles wildfires earlier this year also ravaged a lot of Los Angeles. And while the downtown area wasn't as impacted, a lot of these business owners still saw the aftermath of this. As Jose described, people weren't going out because they were being advised to get ready to evacuate, meaning that there was a reduced foot traffic. In addition to that, ash was falling from the sky, damaging their inventory and forcing them to close early. And one of the most recent events under the current administration, there has been a lot of immigration enforcement raids where people are being taken off the street from unmarked vehicles without a warrant. This has spread a lot of chaos and worry in the community, meaning that a lot of customers aren't showing up. People are closing stores to not risk put their employees at risk. And I just want to read a quote from Adriana, who's a clothing store owner. And she shared with me that they are taking people away from shopping at our business, and it brings sadness and depression to see that the streets, which one day were so full you couldn't even walk quickly because of the crowds, are now empty here in the fashion district. And there doesn't seem to be a solution coming. So evidently, all these crises together have really placed these businesses on a bad predicament, and they've been struggling a lot since the pandemic. And so while my initial focus was on PPP loans and whether they had actually helped these businesses, I realized that a lot of the people I interviewed were either not familiar with PPP loans or never even knew how to apply or qualified for it. And so instead, I decided to focus on their survival, what they were doing to survive in the absence of PPP funds and other relief programs. And what I learned is that a lot of them actually relied on personal savings, often exhausting them, family support, asking family members to work for them for free instead of having to pay an employee. They also made price adjustments. And a family actually shared with me that they used to sell a pack of 4 socks for $1 5 years ago, and they've increased it to $1.50 to try to get a bit more profit from their business. But even this 50-cent increase over 5 years has driven customers away. They've also taken high interest loans from their suppliers and engaged in practices to hold on to customers, like not charging to use the restroom, not charging for a plastic bag, and even not charging taxes at the point of purchase and paying it out of pocket on a quarterly basis during the sales and use tax reports. And so one of the most interesting findings that I was able to encounter is that a lot of them have actually relied on community and social media to stay afloat during these difficult times. And if you see in this picture, I'm showing right now on the left side, that is Jesus, known as Yanalu on TikTok, and he actually has 300,000 followers. He's a small business owner in the area, and he also uses his platform to try to help other businesses survive and stay afloat. And a lot of the work that he does is following ICE around his community, documenting it through TikTok live stream, and being able to disprove fear-mongering or false ICE reports. For example, in this image, it was reported that ICE was present in the fashion district. He went there himself, uploaded a video and showed that ICE actually wasn't present there to get rid of some of the fear that people had. He also does a lot of promoting for businesses, as you can see in the second picture. And yeah, it just has been a lot of community work and social media to try to get the help that a lot of these businesses haven't received from the government. And so if you look at these images on these slides, these are actually pictures that I took myself. And these are areas that I used to visit as a kid. So in my memory, there are a bunch of stores. You can barely even walk there. And now when I go back there as an adult, it's just really sad to see the difference to what it used to be like. And being able to talk directly to these business owners and being able to do this research has taught me that this is not just about individual hardship, it's also about systemic inequity. The fashion district used to be a place that offered working class Latino self-reliance and an escape from exploitation. Without support, Los Angeles is really risking losing this economic and cultural backbone. And so some of the recommendations, the next steps that I came up with was that we need to expand responsible commercial rent control for small businesses, just like we did for tenants and the places that they rent. We need to make relief programs accessible, offline, and multilingual. We need to improve outreach to disconnected business owners, and we also need to hold federal agencies accountable for the harm they're doing to these businesses. And before I end, I just wanted to share some closing thoughts that I had, which is that these businesses are essential, not disposable. Policies that are centered around equity can also preserve cultural and economic diversity. And finally, saving Latino-owned small businesses means preserving opportunity, affordability, and community resilience in Los Angeles. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Yecenia. Up next, we have Karla de la Cruz, who will be presenting on her work titled Entrepreneurship Under Threat, Latinx Vendors in California's Flea Markets. Karla de la Cruz is a first-generation student pursuing her bachelor's degree in sociology. Her summer internship was with the California Department of Healthcare Access and Information, HCAI, Legislative Office and Equity Office. Karla's interests include researching farm workers and the socioeconomic determinants influencing health disparities in Northern California. Beyond academia, Karla envisions leveraging her education in sociology to empower undocumented communities by challenging systemic oppression through legal advocacy. She has aspirations of attending law school to specialize in immigration law. So welcome, Karla.
Oh, good. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Wait, can you hear you, sir? Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Just to remind you guys, I'm Karla de la Cruz, and I'll be presenting my summer research titled Entrepreneurship Under Threat, Latinx Vendors in California's Flea Markets. And my research question is, what challenges do Latinx entrepreneurs in Northern California flea market spaces face when managing their businesses? And this really led to the sub-question of what structural and economic factors influence their experience. As you can see, there is a focus in Orland, California, and that was done with purpose, right? We go to the #1 public research university, and even in this space, research for Latinx entrepreneurs is very little, specifically for flea market sellers. And so when we do see research out there, it is focused in San Jose area. And so I was really intentional about bringing this to the Orland and the North Market space. But however, this changed throughout my research, and you'll see why this happens, and I can explain more as well. And so, am I able to move this? Yes. And so why this research? So in 2020, Latinos owned 85,000 employer businesses in California. However, there were about 458,000 white-owned businesses. And so there is a lack of already that we can see Latino-owned businesses are significantly smaller than white-owned businesses, but really looking at who is represented within these businesses. Well, I know that often when it comes to when you think Latina entrepreneurs, there is this hidden space of flea market vendors as well. And so why this research? Like I mentioned before, it's to document the lived experiences of Latina immigrant flea markets, also known as pulga vendors, and bring some representation into the academic studies on this community. And then as well to hopefully have a conversation about how we can move forward and support these communities. And so I do want to ask you guys, how many of you guys have been to flea markets or know of these spaces? Okay, most of you. Great. And so, so this space is a very, it's a cultural hub for many communities in smaller towns, and it really does bring a lot of support to the economy in these informal spaces. And so I'll begin with my research methods. So I took a qualitative community-based research approach, focusing on Latina migrant entrepreneurs. My data collection was a semi-structured in-depth interview. And these conversations were originally conducted in Spanish and then translated into English for analysis. And they were guided by open-ended questions about their business history, the challenges in the support system. So really pretty open-ended, so they felt free to really share anything that was on their mind. And I also really want to emphasize my research positionality. I grew up working in these spaces, so I know the significance of that they hold in not only the cultural aspect, but the local economy as well. And my positionality did allow me to get a greater trust building, a deeper narrative that can often be overlooked in formal surveys. However, given everything that was going on in the summer, it was extremely difficult finding people that would come forward and share their story with me, even as somebody within the community. The person that I interviewed actually expressed that they were hesitant, and I asked them, "Are you sure you want to continue this?" They said yes, they thought it was important, and so I'm here to share her story today. So I interviewed Mari Duarte. Mari Duarte is a 40-year-old woman who migrated here from Mexico. She's a former jewelry shop owner in Mexico, and now she focuses on flea market vendors. She sells toys, jewelry, seasonal items. Think, for example, fidget toys. And she sells these in Orland, Modesto, Stockton, and California. I said earlier that my main focus was in Northern California, and I'll explain why there is this shift in different locations as well later in the presentation. Her experience is 10 plus years of managing stalls, and she really considers herself very disciplined in reinvestment and trend adaptation. And so just for some more context, she moved here from Mexico after experiencing some economic downturns back in her home country. So after interviewing her, I concluded 3 main findings. And so that these findings are influencing her business right now, and she's really struggling to maintain her business. So the first one would be political climate and economic uncertainty. As we know, the recent ICE raids were extremely difficult. Leading on to Yecenia's presentation, she provided great detail of that, and documentation status was a really big barrier for her as well. And another one that I considered was migration, which I consider this push factor, and I'll elaborate more on the following presentation or the following slide. And so I also did create this visual, which really allowed me to sort of represent how I interpreted my findings. So there are the structural barriers, the political climate and documentation status, and then those are the consequences. So political climate leads to the economic uncertainty and the loss of established business, and the documentation status leads to a survival-based entrepreneurship and housing precarity. So mapping mobility and housing insecurity. I mentioned before, my focus was in Northern California, but when I spoke to Mari, she really emphasized that her moving and migrating from Mexico, the reason why she entered this space was because she had these skills. She had a set establishment in Mexico, but now with her limited opportunities, all she can really enter are these flea market spaces. So as a result, she chases down these markets all throughout the state. For example, Stockton, Modesto, Los Angeles, Orland, and as a result, now she has been having to sleep in her car. And this is a very common story among all other sellers in flea market spaces as well, because they are traveling so often. They have to stay somewhere, right? And if you guys have been to flea market spaces, you know that the stalls, there's so many goods, so many products within each stall. But the truth is that after you guys leave, these people have to take down their stalls, put everything back in their car, and travel onto a new place. And really, this makes it extremely difficult. She mentions that the winters are cold, the summers are hot often. Because she has to travel all throughout the weekend, sleep is very little. Often she gets 3 hours, sometimes she gets no sleep. She switches between her husband to get to these cells. And now that even with these barriers, now she's experiencing legal and financial and struggles. And so the lack of legal protections is something that has really affected her. She has no safety nets, for example. Now there's no unemployment for her to fall back on, so she has to continue to do this work. There is very limited access to capital, and even when there is access, it is very little known within the community. And so really enforcing capital literacy would be super important as well. And all these connected together really create a reliance on informal suppliers and personal savings. And she tells me, ahora solo sale para sobrevivir, no para ahorrar, which means now it's only enough to survive, not to save. So because of everything that was happening during the summer, she's just really been having to survive through her business and not necessarily profit off anything. Again, describing on the political climate and economic uncertainty. When she thinks about her business right now, she reflects a lot on COVID because, as we know, COVID impacted small businesses significantly. But this time she describes that it feels longer, it feels deeper, and she doesn't have much hope. For example, the immigration enforcement and fears, ICE raids, as we saw in LA, they left stalls abandoned and goods were lost. And also as a result, there's been a reduced traffic and stability. And so she said that her sales have gone down. And also, while I did only interview her, she also reflected a lot on her community and described that food vendors as well are really, really struggling from this because they are losing, their produce is going bad. They're losing entirely everything. They can't pack anything in their car and resell it the next weekend. And so as a result, again, today's downturns feel deeper and longer. And I really also just want to reflect that the fear and sales declines just collapse. And these are not personal failings, but systemic obstacles all combined as well. And so how do we support these flea market spaces? I think right now, it's really important to just begin by protecting these existing spaces. These communities are hurting, sharing knowledge between us. I mean, this is partly, right, part of the process of sharing information and focusing on creating a space where we can provide information for these sellers as well. I also want to share that when I interviewed my participant, she actually came in with questions for me because she said, since you are part of school and have some knowledge, can you help me come up with a plan in case something were to happen? Which just shows this community is hurting, they're needing information, and really the first step would be by sharing information. And I know it sounds simple, but sharing resources, sharing their rights is where we can begin by protecting these spaces as well. Low cost protections, there are fees that come with selling in a flea market. As Yecenia also mentioned, she pays about $120 a day. And if she's traveling 3 times per weekend, she's selling about $360. I'm really bad at math, but around that price in fees, right? And that's deducted from her gas as well. So there's not much. As we can tell, just this community is really, really struggling right now. So my proposal would be currently the federal level is extremely difficult to deal with. And so I really working with nonprofits, foundations at the community level, and working with people that are willing to support this community as well, willing to share information, is just extremely important at the moment. So that was the end of my presentation.
Woo!
I'd like to thank everybody who supported me through the process, and more specifically to Madi for coming forward and sharing her story. It was extremely difficult. It was actually a 2-hour conversation that I had with her, and it was a very heavy conversation, but I think very real and very needed for right now. To be able to come here and share the story with her and spread the knowledge. It's a representation, and I think it's in the most time right now, it's what we need. Thank you. Good job, Karla.
Thank you, Karla. All right, next we have a group presentation. It will be Rona, Lasam, and Naydelin, Chimil. I'm sorry. The title of their work is The Untold Stories of Self-Employed Immigrant Latina Housekeepers During the LA Wildfire. You're already here? Okay. So let me introduce you then. All right. So to my left is Rona Lasam. Rona is a senior at the University of California, Berkeley, majoring in political economy with a minor in data science. Rona's summer internship was with Cal Recycle. They are a first-generation immigrant from the Philippines and a queer low-income student from Van Nuys, California. Anyone from there?
Represent A1A.
Rona's academic and professional journey is deeply rooted in a commitment to advocating for marginalized communities. Their unwavering passion for social justice is shaped by a personal experience growing up in a community where resilience outweighed resources. It's powerful. Next, to my right, we have Naydelin, who is a recent graduate who was a transfer student and majored in society and environment. This summer, Naydelin interned with California Department of Toxic Substances Control. Fueled by firsthand experiences of environmental and social injustice in her community, she actively advocates against systemic racism. With a relentless curiosity and a commitment to public service, Naydelin contributes to a unique perspective to public policy. As a former youth city council member for the City District 1 of Los Angeles, she brings a passion for further learning about policymaking to make a difference. As a low-income student, Naydelin aims to empower individuals with similar backgrounds, providing opportunities for exploration and learning across diverse fields. Give it up for Naydelin and Rona.
Thank you for that very kind welcoming, Adriana. Like Adriana said, I'm Rona. I'm Naydelin, and this is our research project, The Untold Stories of Self-Employed Immigrant Latina Housekeepers During the 2025 Palisades Fire.
Okay, my bad.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of our research project, we kind of wanted to give background context as to what the problem is, the event that happened, and our motivations. So the problem is that foreign-born Latina housekeepers are a vulnerable workforce. They often face low wages, poor health outcomes, and financial instability. And during the Palisades Fire and during our research, as well as present day, as already previous D&E researchers mentioned, there is a lot of immigration enforcement happening. So that's also another barrier that they face or issue. And the event that happened was in January of 2025 in the Pacific Palisades, was a fire, and that exposed how these specific workers' livelihoods are directly tied to their clients' homes, and thus making them very vulnerable to natural disasters. And what motivated us? Well, we witnessed firsthand our community members, family, friends who were impacted by the fire because they are Latina housekeepers themselves. And so that led us to our research question. How has the 2025 Palisades Fire impacted self-employed immigrant Latina housekeepers? So our research method was qualitative, and we did this through 4 interviews. So we really wanted to contextualize and humanize our participants because they are more than just data. So first, we also didn't use their names because privacy reasons. But Marie is an immigrant from Mexico, and she came here at the age of 20. She's undocumented, self-employed. She has been working as a housekeeper for about 26 years now. And prior to the Palisades Fire, she used to manage about 12 clients. But now on good days, she manages at most like 1 or 2. And this is a quote from her. I was supposed to work at a house twice a week for 6 years, but now I do not have a job. And our second participant is Amelia. She's an indigenous Latina immigrant who migrated to the US at a young age and is now a US citizen. She has been working in this industry for 45 years. And during the Palisades Fire, she had to miss work and thus lost about $1,500 in income in 2 weeks. Additionally, she also lives in downtown LA and has to use public transportation to commute to work. And that's around a 20 to 30 mile commute every day that she has to go to work. And her quote is, after working with them, her clients, 4 years, They have become another family to me and their home. I was more terrified of them losing their house than losing my job. And our next two clients is Fatima. She's also an indigenous Latina immigrant who's undocumented and self-employed. She came to the US at the age of 22. She's been working as a housekeeper for 10 years. And during the Palisades fire, she commuted daily for 12 miles from downtown LA to her clients' homes. And this is her quote. I said, thank you to God. It, as in the fire, did not get all the way there to her client's house. And as I was also sad for the losses of others whose homes were burnt and the people who were left without jobs. And lastly, Oceana migrated to the US at a young age. She has worked as a housekeeper for 21 years. She began working with 4 clients, but now only works with 1. And during the Palisades fire, her client, luckily, house was not affected, and she was compensated when she missed work because of how unsafe the air quality was. And her quote was, as I walk by the roads, I remember when I used to walk him, her client's dog, and I will no longer see the dogs running around, nor my housekeeper friends whose clients moved somewhere else or who lost their jobs.
Okay, so now I'll be depicting a bit more about how the Palisades fire affected the city or the neighborhood itself, as well as the neighboring neighborhoods around there. So this is kind of just to demonstrate a bit more about how the spread was. So obviously in the very beginning, you see on day 1, it's a little bit smaller, and it's really mainly particular in the neighborhoods of the Palisades fire. And then you can see it spread, it goes on to Agora Hills neighborhood, as well as Westwood area, and a bit more towards the valley's centric area. So you can tell that the smoke, not necessarily just the fire affected, but also the smoke was also an impact to the neighboring cities and neighborhoods. And then I want to also depict kind of a picture of how many homes were lost, also affected in the fire. And the red ones are the ones that were destroyed, and then the orange ones are the majorly destroyed, but not totally, and then minor as the yellow one, and then kind of that. So this image is just more to depict the fact that how many homes were lost and how many small business entrepreneurs, like housekeepers, were affected by the fire. And so this is just an image to demonstrate the impact of the fire. So here's a map that I made. And so this I want to represent a bit of where our participants live, which is a red point. So you can tell one of them lives in Chatsworth, San Fernando, and 2 of them live in downtown LA. And the ones in the green pinpoints are where their clients live. So this is kind of to show the distance of how far they live. Oh, my bad. Oh, I guess I'll speak. And so, as you guys may know, LA is not the best transportation friendly. So commuting from the valley, for example, all the way to the Palisades fire, it's really bad. 405, you already know. So it's kind of just to depict how far these participants live from their clients, as well as where these business centers that California offers small business supplies or their centers are, and they're kind of mainly prominently in areas that are wealthy, like the Palisades fire. And so I also have on here and graded it by the population, so how dense it is. So the more orange it is, how much more denser it is. So you can tell that these business centers are not located in dense cities and away from where our participants work from. So it's a lot more, or further from where they live, and making it a much more of a barrier to getting aid or getting help in applying for financial relief. So one of the key things we noticed was the lack of media coverage, and a lot of the things that we didn't notice that Rona and I didn't really didn't really notice was until we spoke to our participants, and one of our participants mentioned, nobody thinks about us, they think about poor people, but they do not consider us. Some people have good work and others depend on it to feed their families, but sometimes they do not see it. And I think Marie really captures the fact that a lot of the impact that it had on entrepreneurs were not visible to the media. Majority of the coverage on the Palisades fire was about homeowners, celebrities, homes that were lost, and not about the onions of layer that there are of the impact it had on entrepreneurs. And a lot of, again, like what I mentioned, a lot of the themes that we noticed as well was from talking to these participants and not from what was covered in the media. So another key theme, again, was no financial relief. And so Amelia, for example, she writes, or she spoke to us and said, they, meaning the radio host, said something about financial relief for all businesses, but it did not mean all businesses. I only heard them talk about it 3 times. And Amelia is one of our participants that is more on the, how would you say it, like older, generations. And so a lot of those older generations rely on radios to get majority of their information. So for her to only hear it 3 times and kind of notice that these financial reliefs weren't meant for entrepreneurs that are small businesses, specifically that are housekeepers, it kind of really highlights the fact that a lot of these financial assistance wasn't publicized, as well as made an effort to reach to these minority entrepreneurs. And on here I have a map where these small business centers are located, and you can tell majority are located in the Westwood, Brentwood, Palisades area, more on the west side of Los Angeles. So that's where the majority of the more wealthier neighborhoods are located. And even though some of them, like, for example, only one being the Valley, that's like, for example, that's the Women's Business Center. But the fact that someone from like Amelia or Fatima who live in the downtown LA region would have to commute all the way to the Women's Business Center, except the fact is that the Women's Business Center doesn't actually support all businesses. It's mainly focused on businesses with properties and as well as federal aid. So for example, Marie, who is undocumented, she would not be able to receive this financial aid due to her lack of a social security number and, for example, a business license. So not all business centers can support each business entrepreneur, even if it's close by to where they live. And so another key thing that we noticed was the workplace health concerns. So for example, Fatima, who was working during the Palisades fire, she mentioned it irritated my eye and throat. It would hurt me for 3 hours, even while wearing a mask. So again, even though she was wearing a mask and protective gear during the Palisades fire, it still affected her health. And I put on here a map that mentions the BTEX concentration, which are 4 carcinogen chemicals or hazardous, So the point is, like, the LA Fire Health composed a data brief on the volatile organic compounds, and just to kind of demonstrate it, they took measurements of the air quality during the fire, and then when there was still burning, but it was only like not active burning, but it was more like smoke, and then off gassing, which is basically no smoke, no fire. And so what we noticed here that indoor air quality actually got worse when there was no fire and no smoke. So it was actually still impacting, for example, these entrepreneurs who were housekeepers, because majority of these chemicals still remain into the furniture, like the couches, the beds. So even though there is no fire, it's still prominent in their workplace. Kind of demonstrating again that, like, just because there's no fire doesn't mean that that health concern is still not there, and it's still prominent even if you're close by to the fire. Okay. And so this is, again, it's kind of like the key takeaways about what we learned. So one of them was, again, like the financial instability. And again, it was one of them, the pointers that we found was that the state as well as the city and county are not really taking protections to help vulnerable working populations, especially in perilous fields where they depend on their clients for income, as well as having like clients in general. And we also saw that there was a lack of required documentation, for example, like a lack of business license and legal documentation. And then we also saw there was limited economic alternatives, like where they couldn't skip work during the fire, for example, because they relied on their income. And we also saw some lack of awareness, like, again, no media coverage on what the impact of the fire had on the housekeepers, as well as the urgent intervention needed for future natural disasters. As you know, climate change will be continuing and fires will be continuing and getting worse. So this is kind of a prominent issue that will be happening again and hurting small businesses, especially especially housekeepers. And then another one, again, that we noticed was unsafe working conditions. As I mentioned, a lot of the air quality indoors is still impacted despite the fire being gone. And then on here, I have a quote: how can the state protect domestic workers from post-wildfire pollutants while ensuring they are not forced to risk their life to earn a living? So again, going back to the fact that, like, how could one still continue working and make an income even though there's a natural disaster going on, for example?
Okay, well, thank you, Naydelin, for really showcasing the issues that arise from the experiences of our participants. And so to answer your question, we came up with a few recommendations. You know, there's always things we can do, the government can do, but this is just what we believe. Yeah, nonprofits, media outlets can do. And the first one being increasing accessibility and awareness of resources for immigrant domestic workers. And that can look like creating grants or micro loan programs, nonprofits co-hosting application clinics for these said grants and micro loan programs, as well as government agencies and nonprofits expanding financial literacy workshops, because even though these programs could exist or be created, that doesn't necessarily mean that folks can like understand, oh, this is like what I can do, like this and that, because it's just financial stuff is just very hard to like understand. And that being said, all these programs must be offered multilingual support and be low barrier and flexible. And our second recommendation is for media, and that is for them to increase coverage to alleviate immigrant domestic worker stories. And that can look like media outlets collaborating with more diverse media platforms. That can look like local journalists collaborating with advocacy groups to learn and highlight stories just like our participants. That could look like media outlets working directly with workers and community organizations, or even creating a journalism like training program and fellowships specifically for immigrants to tell their own stories. And our third recommendation is to enhance outreach strategies to reach vulnerable populations effectively. One of the lit reviews and like past research has shown that outreach via like community or like having like an ambassador outreach system is the best way to disseminate information. So that's what we really recommend. And lastly is to prioritize health and safety in working conditions post disaster, because the government and these nonprofit orgs really like focus on like taking out like the fire or like cleaning up the disaster, but like Naydelin said, there's still these effects that like happen even if it's mitigated. So really focusing on that, and that could look like public health organizations working alongside labor advocacy groups to host mobile health clinics, info sessions. That could look like providing funding to these community clinics that do work directly with these populations, so they could offer low-cost respiratory health screenings. And yes, that was our presentation. Thank you. Okay.
We want to say thank you to the IGS team, the D&E fellowship as well, and our friends and family who are here supporting us.
Oh,
Those online.
Also, thank you to the Matsui Center staff, Ezra, Adriana, Ruben, there's more people, Christine, everyone.
No, you got it.
Okay, thank you. And our participants who allowed us to share their story.
I'm just gonna leave it for you, Ezra.
Thank you, Rona and Naydelin. Up next, we have Cristal Amezcua. Cristal is a recent graduate and first-generation Latina student who majored in political science. Cristal interned this past summer with California State Assembly member John Harabedian. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. She was raised in the California Central Valley and attended college of the Sequoias in Visalia, California, prior to transferring to Cal. She's the daughter of Mexican immigrants from the states of Michoacan and Zacatecas. Her identity of being a Latina and an unconventional college student is what makes her passionate about advocating for educational equity and immigration reform policy. So Cristal will be talking to us about her project titled Equity in Emergency Response, Addressing Multilingual Communication Barriers, and she will be joining us through Zoom.
Thank you, Adriana, for that presentation. I will begin sharing my screen now. Give me 1 second. Okay, great. So hi everyone again. My name is Cristal Amezcua, and my research was focused on equity and emergency research, response addressing multilingual communication barriers. Also, I'm sorry, do you guys see?
Yes.
We're good.
Okay. So wildfires in California are becoming more frequent and more severe, affecting entire regions across the state. And while everyone is impacted, Spanish-speaking business owners face unique challenges during these disasters. When emergency alerts and disaster relief programs are only provided in English, many residents and business owners are left without access to critical information that can help them prepare, stay safe, and recover. So this right here are pictures of the aftermath of the Altadena and Pacific Palisades fire. And this summer, I actually had the opportunity to intern in the office of Assembly Member Harbedian, which was mentioned, whose district was directly impacted by the Altadena fires. During that time, I saw firsthand how critical it is for communities to receive timely and accessible information during emergencies. And while I was there, I was getting emails and phone calls every day of constituents concerned on how to proceed after these wildfire disasters, what resources they should reach out to, and what offices they should be getting in contact with, which really mobilized me to see this research now from an administrative and legislative side. So these challenges bring us to the main problem and the research question. Latino-owned businesses are vital pillars for California's economy, yet they're too often excluded from recovery efforts because of language barriers. Ensuring equity and emergency communication is not just a matter of convenience, it is a matter of safety and recovery. And this leads me to my main research question of how can policymakers expand language access to ensure that Latino-owned businesses are not excluded from wildfire recovery efforts? To explore this question, I used 3 different research methods. First, I conducted web-based assessments to review the language accessibility of government websites, such as comparing websites like the California Office of Emergency Services and comparing it with the Assembly Speaker's website. Second, I used the comparative approach to analyze preferred languages spoken within different California facilities. Finally, I conducted a policy review of existing California legislation, such as with AB 1638 that was introduced and passed by Assemblymember Fong in 2023 to understand the current efforts and gaps within language access. My research revealed several key findings. The Daimali and Alatorre Bilingual Services Act of 1973 currently requires state and local agencies that serve a substantial number of non-English speaking residents to provide information in those languages. However, the current act allows too much discretion in defining what qualifies as substantial, which continues creating inconsistencies. The California State Auditor made a report that although these state agencies do provide bilingual services required by this Act of 1973, 8 out of the 10 state agencies that they audited still don't have a established procedure on how to regularly assess the language services that they are providing to any clients that they are assisting with. I also found that there are many legislative offices representing wildfire-affected districts that have limited multilingual capacity, especially when it comes to Spanish-speaking communities. I found that many of these offices lack translated materials, even though those resources are essential for helping constituents during disaster relief. When I was reviewing my key findings, I conducted a web-based analysis to examine how language access is provided online. I compared the California Office of Emergency Service website with the Assembly Speaker Revis's website. And you can kind of see it here. I have like 2 search bars there. On the California Office of Assembly of Emergency Services site, there is an option to select a preferred language so that the information could be accessed directly in that language. However, on Speaker Revis's website, which is the link, the picture right below, it does not provide that. It does not provide that option, and this creates a harmful gap for many Spanish-speaking business owners, legislators' website may be their main form or their first form of contact with government resources. And if that site is not accessible in their language, they are effectively being prevented from obtaining critical information they need to prepare for and recover from disasters. Based on these findings, I recommend several solutions. First, there should be a continued statewide standard for multilingual alert systems. The California Office of Assembly, I propose that the California Office of Assembly of Emergency Services should enforce a statewide standard for emergency alerts, mandating that counties with Spanish-speaking populations above 5% provide both Spanish and English alerts through text, radio, and television services. And this idea builds on the legislation such as AB 1638 by Assemblymember Fong, which I reviewed during my policy analysis. AB 1638 currently requires local public agencies to provide information in another language when 5% or more of the population speaks that language. So expanding this framework to legislative websites and other constituent-facing platforms would ensure that Spanish-speaking business owners and residents have this consistent access to vital emergency information. My second recommendation is to allocate funding to multilingual outreach coordinators. This proposal would specifically allocate annual funding to wildfire-prone counties, which would then create liaisons between Spanish-speaking businesses and emergency responders. Additionally, multilingual outreach coordinators should conduct pre- and post-disaster resource navigation in Spanish, alongside collaborating with local chambers of commerce and small business development agencies to continue supporting these Spanish-speaking small businesses. Last, I proposed a data tracking requirement. This proposal would collect demographic data on the languages spoken within counties that have received disaster aid. Agencies conducting the data tracking would monitor the percentage of Spanish-speaking businesses that have received financial assistance, identify gaps in outreach and language access delivery, and report all of this information back to the California Office of Emergency Service. And this proposal is modeled after a survey of data collection in the healthcare field currently. In conclusion, Latino-owned businesses are a vital part of California's economy, but they're often left behind during wildfire recovery efforts because of language barriers. Expanding multilingual communication is not simply a policy choice, it is a matter of safety, equity, and resilience. By ensuring that Spanish-speaking business owners have equal access to information and resources, California can build stronger and safer communities. My last point that I want to make is I'm currently working for an assembly member, and I have access to the member's website. And in my role currently, I'm able to put in a request to change my member's website to have preferred languages, like in the Office of Emergency Services, and people visiting that website could click their preferred language. And I think that these solutions may be small, but they could go a long way in having language access to people. And I think that there just needs to be more mobilization so people could see the importance of language access and communication, especially when it comes to emergency relief and disaster relief, again, to build a stronger and safer community within California. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Cristal. Nice to see you from afar. All right, so When thinking about who would be a great discussant for this panel, I immediately thought of Dr. Rocio Rosales, and we are honored to welcome her today. Dr. Rosales is an associate professor of sociology and an associate dean of faculty development at UC Irvine. She researches and teaches in the areas of international migration, immigrant detention, race and ethnicity, and qualitative methods. She's the author of Fruteros, Street Vending, Illegality, and Ethnic Community in Los Angeles, which examines the social worlds of young Latino street vendors as they navigate the complexities of local and federal laws prohibiting both their presence and their work on street corners. Her work brings crucial expertise on how immigration policy shapes the day-to-day realities of immigrant workers and business owners, particularly in informal and precarious sectors of the economy, such as a dynamic that thread through each of the presentations that we saw today from our panelists. So her insights will help us understand the broader structural context behind the stories we heard today from our fellows. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rosales.
Obstacle course. Well, thank you for the invitation to come and listen to these presentations. I feel my heart is warmed by all of the focus, like the different focuses that like you all have based on like populations that are often forgotten or ignored or silenced. And so, you know, my heart is overflowing with really affection for like this new wave of scholars who are coming up. And as I'm listening to your work, you know, I think that there are both really large structural systemic things that are happening that are impacting these communities over which we might have less control over, right? And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind, right? Moving forward, if you think of policy change, it might be difficult, if not impossible. And so, whereas sometimes you're encouraged to think bigger, I am asking you to think smaller, in that sometimes change and help can come from neighbors and community more effectively and faster than structural change may come, right? And so this is like on all levels, like as opposed to looking towards the federal government, we can look to the state, right? As opposed to looking for immigration policy change, we can look towards communities and how they might be able to respond to issues. And I thought that, like, you know, there's a really wonderful threads between all four projects and like the work that I do, because I work on informal economies, I work on Latino communities, and I'm always kind of also keeping an eye towards like big systemic issues that are facing. For those first two presentations by Yecenia and Karla, obviously this is like right in my wheelhouse, right? I remember early on in my graduate career, I was doing interviews with street vendors who are working in the fashion district. And then I was also reading a lot of scholars who are doing research in both like ethnic enclave communities, like the fashion district is, in Los Angeles, and like the produce market in Los Angeles. But I was also reading about flea markets, right? Some scholars who are studying about flea markets in Chicago, in LA. And so I was very much steeped in literature that was talking about what happens in these spaces and how their very presence are kind of acts of resilience, right? And promise. Flea markets in particular that are kind of like, they come alive and then they disappear. And I think every time that they do exist, they showcase, the resiliency of the vendors who operate within them. I was wondering though, like how much for both the Latino businesses in the fashion district and in flea markets, like another major issue lies in the changing consumption patterns of customers, for which all of us are kind of, enmeshed in, right? Like, I can see that a lot of people might resort to ordering things off of Amazon versus going to the fashion district, right? And so I wonder, in your explanation, Yecenia, of like all the different things that have impacted the decline of customers in the fashion district, including rising rents, gas prices, wildfires, ICE raids, all of these are very real. That combined with the changing, ways in which people buy. And so I wonder if like a useful intervention there is to begin to change the culture on like the small scale, to encourage people to go to these spaces, like buy local, right? These buy local campaigns that are meant to do just this, right? To like change the patterns that exist, to support local businesses, and to show up to fashion districts, instead of purchasing from Amazon, right? Or these larger conglomerates. And the same consumption issue question comes with flea markets, right? So like that policy intervention of encouraging community members to buy local might be a smaller scale intervention that ends up changing how people think about these spaces so that they remain vibrant, right? And alive in these communities. So again, we might not be able to do much about the fear that like ICE raids have, but those people who can and who have like a community-oriented mindset, they might be convinced to go to these spaces and keep them going, right? So that's just like another way, another issue, the consumption issue, but a smaller policy intervention that comes at the community level. And so the same thing for the last two presentations. As I was listening to these two presentations, I was really struck that like it's important to remember all the people who are not the focus immediately, right? And sometimes people never arrive to those populations, and sometimes it takes presentations like yours and research like yours to kind of shift the focus away from the immediate person, like the homeowner who lost the home, but to see everyone else who's impacted by the loss of homes following the fires, and by like the impact of disasters on people who don't have access to like language, emergency systems. So I really think that focus is the first step in understanding that there are different needs in different communities. I do remember, because I live in Los Angeles, when the Palisades fire and the Eden fires were taking place, the videos that I was actually seeing on Instagram were often being shot by the workers who were fleeing, right? Like the landscapers who were trying to get out and trying to get out of the other people, the nannies and the housekeepers who usually would bus into the area, who were suddenly caught there without transportation out. Right. And so as I'm watching all of these videos, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is like a different level of crisis that I did not comprehend, and immediately was like, all these same people who are fleeing, who are like daily inhabitants of the same space, but from a different socioeconomic class, are also going to be the people that are forgotten once we start thinking about recovery. And so I'm really glad that these two presentations have an eye towards those populations so that they're not ignored in like the policy that's created. So, I'm so happy that talking about the focus is on the Palisades, but the focus is really on the housekeepers in the Palisades and how they'll recover. And again, it's really difficult to think of large scale solutions to something like an environmental crisis, right? To the ever-present threat of fires, and the very slow road to recovery, right? Because even if people build back, there's always a threat of like the environmental exposure that like the fires have left in the ground, right? And so I am thinking now of like the resiliency of the housekeepers who work there, of the immigrants in other spaces who, by virtue of being migrants, are probably imbued with a lot of resiliency, right? And I wonder how community-based programs based in their neighborhoods might be able to assist them in finding alternate forms of work, So, and this is tying the last presentation to the presentation on housekeepers. Like, if we're thinking about emergency responses and language alerts, might we also think about these alerts providing information about relief efforts in multiple languages, right? So like if we built up within California emergency alert systems such that we all get texts on our phones when something is happening, might we be able to do something about that that also informs people on their phones and an alert of like resources that are suddenly available, right? Because like just as we need to know when there is an Amber Alert, we might also need to learn very quickly that there is like a relief aid, available for community members. And so for Cristal, I was thinking, not only having language accessibility on websites, but also having more phone numbers or ways to reach people in real time through their phones and whatnot might be like, those alerts don't often come in multiple languages. So how do we think about the things that are reaching people's phones and how to make sure that everybody who gets it can understand what is being said? So that's another sort of way of thinking about equity and emergency response. But I am so impressed with all the presentations that I heard this afternoon and this morning. And my only advice is keep going, keep to thinking about these populations, keep tracking down these narratives and stories, because that's certainly the first step to ensuring that these populations receive the policy and interventions that they really deserve. So congratulations to you all.
So do all the panelists want to come take a seat? Yeah, let's have you stay here and sit down with them. Yeah, I think we have enough chairs. And have a conversation. And do you want to respond to Dr. Rosales?
Thank you so much for your good question. And I agree, I think starting with a current administration that's so hard to navigate with. Sorry. Being at the local level is extremely important, working with allies that are willing to support these communities as well and spreading information like I share is extremely important. So your question is, what are some tools or tactics that can be used to help customers to shop at the local level? I think, like I said, spreading information, and then also I do have a follow-up question regarding that, because in my research I found that because flea market sellers are traveling, a lot of the times they are very disconnected from community because they are very on the individual level. And so I think starting by creating a community within these spaces and really supporting these sellers.
I can go next. I want to first thank you for taking the time to listen. Oh, sorry. Thank you for taking the time to listen and to give feedback to all of our research. It's an honor to be here with you. But also, as I was listening to what you were saying, it did strike me that our recommendations were really focused on external support, like government, nonprofits, so community centers. But I think, like you said, realizing that yes, they can make change and that does take time, but we have the power now to make change today if we really wanted to. And so I started thinking about how can I actually come back to my community and help these folks? And that could look like even just connecting these housekeepers together and creating some type of way, because there's so many in LA. I know so many, they're in my network, and just connecting them with each other, because that's how they get these jobs. It's mainly recommendations and relying on that and creating that network, because they are going through the same issues, and also so they have a space where they can feel oh, I am not alone, is what I was realizing, at least for my participant that I interviewed. So that's actually what I'm going to do when I go back. But yeah, thank you for reminding us that like we can still make change, and even if it's small, it like adds up. So thank you.
Yeah, as Rona said too, I think like thank you again for coming as well as giving us kind of like feedback in terms of like our presentation. And I was thinking about that too, about like community organizations wise. There's a community organization called Cielo. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's like Comunidad, which is like Community for Indigenous Empowerment. I can't remember necessarily their acronym, but they were one of the organizations in Los Angeles that supports Indigenous community members. And so two of our participants did know about that application, about and they're usually types of organization that provides resources to, again, Indigenous community members, especially during natural disasters. So for the Palisades Fire and the Altadena Fire, they were providing some financial relief to anyone who was affected by the fires. And so Fatima and Amelia both knew about these two resources, except during the interview that I had with them, they mentioned that they didn't believe that their financial loss was as major as others, so they didn't apply. And that's kind of like more of the stigma that I was hearing about too, that like not sort of stigma, but it's like they feel like others are more worthy of that money instead of them, even though they were affected by it. So I was kind of going back to like, I feel like there was a lot more work that they knew about from organizations instead of like the financial relief that the city or the county or the state was providing. So kind of just tying back to the fact that like, what can the state, what can the county, and what can the city do to provide these guidance and financial reliefs to those who are affected by the fire, but also just in general, any financial reliefs instead of having community members rely on organizations that they know or from their networks to get these reliefs as well.
Yeah, I think I'm next. I want to say thank you so much for your feedback, and I really appreciated you bringing up that there has been a shift towards e-commerce. It's definitely something that I brought up in my op-ed, but completely forgot to mention in my presentation. It's definitely something that has been impacting these communities that I focused on. And not only that, but I also didn't mention that my parents are also business owners in the Los Angeles Fashion District. And I feel like I can't even count the amount of times that they've told me, like, Mija, like, you're going to be able to take over this business, and you know how to use technology, you're going to be able to shift towards online shopping and be able to make online sales. And I feel like locally we can also do something to help people advertise online on the internet. If not selling online, then at least being able to advertise whatever they're selling there, and that would be really beneficial.
I think we have time for one question, if anybody in the audience wants that. Okay, then thank you. Join me in thanking and congratulating this panel. And please remember, we are gathering at the in the courtyard. So for the reception, feel free to ask any additional questions to the panels there. Thank you so much, everyone.